For as long as he could remember, life had been simple, almost painfully so. The young boy, now a teenager on the verge of adulthood, grew up in a small orphanage attached to a humble church. His earliest memories were faint whispers of another life, one where his mother had been alive, loving and kind, though she was always tired. She had fallen ill when he was just 6 years old, and before he could fully grasp the situation, she was gone. The disease had taken her quickly, too fast for any of the prayers or cheap medicines they could afford to make a difference. He had been left alone in a world that felt much too big and harsh for someone so small. The orphanage, a modest building beside the church, became his home after her passing. The nuns and caregivers who ran the orphanage were kind but firm, doing their best to provide for the children who lived there. The place was maintained through donations from the local community, a congregation of hard-working, humble people who barely had enough of themselves but gave what they could on Sundays or during special services. Despite the lack of resources, the orphanage never lacked warmth. It was a place where the children could feel safe, even if the world outside seemed unforgiving. He quickly learned to help around the orphanage, doing small chores for the caregivers, sweeping floors, serving meals, and tending to the small garden where they grew a few vegetables. Despite the care he received, there was always an emptiness in his heart, a void left by the absence of his mother. Every year, on her birthday, he made his way to the small cemetery just behind the church. The graves were simple, marked only by wooden crosses and the occasional engraved stone for those whose families could afford it. His mother's grave, however, was marked only by a plain wooden cross, the letters of her name slowly fading with time. As he knelt there, the wind whispering through the trees, he spoke softly to her, hoping that wherever she was, she could hear him. "May, I hope you're watching over me," he would say, the words slipping easily into the quietness. "One day, I'll make you proud." In the quiet moments at her grave, he often felt the weight of his promise. He was only 16, but life had already shown him how difficult it was to keep such vows. His world was small, bound by the walls of the orphanage, the narrow streets of the town, and the limits of what he could achieve without money or connections. Yet, he never stopped dreaming. He dreamed of a life where he could rise above the poverty he had known, of a life where he could give back to those who had cared for him, and of a life where he could finally stand before his mother's grave and say, "I did it." His days were consumed by routine. Every morning, he attended school, walking the dusty roads to the small building that served as the local high school. His classmates were much like him, humble, from families struggling to make ends meet. But unlike many of them, he couldn't go home after school. His afternoons were spent working at the local bakery, a job he had started when he was 14, thanks to the owner, Senor Joao, who had been a friend of his mother's. Joao had offered him the job out of sympathy, knowing how hard life had become for the boy after his mother's death. The bakery was small, just a hole in the wall where the smell of fresh bread filled the air every morning. The customers were regulars, people from the neighborhood who knew each other by name. They were kind, but none of them could do much to change his circumstances. Everyone was trying to survive. At the bakery, his tasks were simple: sweeping the floors, arranging the bread, and attending to customers when things got busy. Joao, the owner, was a patient man who often shared stories about the boy's mother, how she had been a regular at the bakery before she got sick, how she used to bring him as a little boy to buy sweet rolls, and how she always smiled, even when life was difficult. These stories were comforting, but they also deepened the ache inside him. He longed to know more about her, to have more than just memories that felt like they were fading with each passing day. Despite the monotony of his life, he held on to a dream. He had always been curious, always wanting to learn more, to understand how the world worked. Joao had noticed this, and sometimes brought him old newspapers or books that he found lying around. The boy devoured them, especially anything related to business or economics. The concepts fascinated him. The idea that with the right knowledge, you could build something from nothing. It was like a secret world, a world he wanted to be a part of, but one that still seemed so far out of reach. Then one day, Something happened that would change everything. It was a quiet afternoon, and the bakery was empty, save for a few customers who came in for their daily bread. As he was cleaning up the front counter, he heard the distinct rumble of an engine outside. Looking through the window, he saw something he had never seen before, a sleek, expensive car pulling up to the curb. The door opened and a man stepped out, dressed in a suit that seemed completely out of place in their humble neighborhood. The man entered the bakery, his presence commanding the room. He was tall, well-groomed, and moved with a confidence that seemed almost foreign in such a small, quiet town. The boy couldn't take his eyes off him. The man ordered a coffee, speaking calmly into his phone while he waited. He was unlike anyone the boy had ever seen, a figure from a different world. The boy continued to watch as the man sipped his coffee, barely noticing the simple surroundings of the bakery. And just as quickly as he had arrived, the man was gone, leaving behind only the scent of his cologne and the image of his luxury car pulling away. That moment stuck with the boy. He had never seen such wealth up close, never felt so distant from a life he secretly dreamed of. The man's presence sparked something inside him, a desire to break free from the limitations that had defined his life until now. He didn't want to stay in this small town forever, living a life of quiet desperation. He wanted more, and from that day on, he was determined to find a way out. After finishing his shift at the bakery that evening, he made his way to the cemetery, as he often did when he needed to clear his head. He knelt before his mother's grave, the fading wood of the cross weathered by years of rain and sun. "May," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the evening air. "I'm going to change things. I'm going to become someone you'd be proud of." The promise felt heavier now, more real than ever before. He had no idea how he would do it, but for the first time, he felt like he had a direction. He would find a way, no matter how hard it would be. The days following the man's visit to the bakery felt different. The boy couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he carried himself, the confidence in his stride, the sleek car that seemed completely out of place in their modest neighborhood. It was as if, in that brief moment, the boy had seen a glimpse of a world he had only imagined through the pages of books and old newspapers. This man, this stranger, was everything he aspired to be, successful, poised, and completely at ease with the power he held. The encounter had sparked something deep within the boy, igniting a desire that had been quietly growing inside him for years. Up until that moment, his world had been defined by limits. The limits of poverty, the constraints of his small town, and the boundaries of his own circumstances. But seeing that man, the way he commanded respect without saying a word, made the boy realize that there was a way out, that there was a path beyond the walls of his current life. He just needed to find it. The idea that he could become something more, that he could break free from the cycle of hardship, consumed him. Every day after school, as he worked in the bakery, he would replay the moment in his mind, imagining what it would be like to step into that man's shoes, to live a life of success and fulfillment. One evening, as he was cleaning up after closing, Joao, the bakery owner, noticed his distant expression. "You've been quiet lately, Garoto," Joao said, his voice warm with familiarity. The boy shrugged, not sure how to explain what he was feeling. How could he put into words the yearning that had taken root in his heart? He had always admired Joao, the way the older man had taken him under his wing after his mother passed, giving him a job and looking out for him. But Joao was content with his simple life, content to serve the same customers day in and day out. The boy knew that deep down, he wanted something more, something Joao could never fully understand. Joao smiled knowingly, as if reading the boy's thoughts. "I've seen that look before," he said, sitting down at one of the small tables near the window. "You're thinking about the future, aren't you? Thinking about what's out there, beyond this little bakery." The boy nodded, still unsure of how to express what was going through his mind. Joao leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "It's good to dream, Garoto. You're May. She was a dreamer too. She always believed you'd do something great one day." The mention of his mother brought a lump to the boy's throat. It was always like that when someone talked about her, especially Joao, who had known her so well. He had few memories of her now, just fragments really. But Joao's stories kept her alive in his mind. He remembered how she used to bring him to the bakery when he was little, her smile bright even when she was sick. "Your May would be proud of you, you know," Joao added softly, his voice full of warmth. "She'd be proud of the man you're becoming." The boy swallowed hard, nodding but unable to respond. His mother's absence was a wound that never fully healed, and every time someone brought her up, it reopened just a little bit. But Joao's words resonated with him, reinforcing the promise he had made at her grave. He would become someone she could be proud of. He would find a way to break out of this life, to rise above the circumstances he'd been born into. And he would do it for her, as much as for himself. That night, after finishing his shift, he walked through the quiet streets of the town, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. The houses he passed were small and worn, their paint peeling from years of neglect. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. It was a familiar scene, one he had grown up with, but now it felt different. He no longer felt like he belonged here, like this was a place he was destined to spend the rest of his life. He felt out of place, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. As he walked, he made his way to the small lawn house a few blocks away. It was a cramped, dimly lit room with a handful of computers, most of them outdated and slow. But it was the only place in town where he could access the internet. The owner, a middle-aged man named Marco, had gotten used to seeing the boy there late at night, sitting in the same corner, his eyes glued to the screen as he soaked up as much information as he could. The boy had saved every cent he could spare to pay for his time at the lawn house, using his earnings from the bakery to invest in his education. Over the past few months, the internet had become his lifeline. He devoured everything he could find on business, economics, and personal development. He read articles, watched videos, and studied the lives of successful people who had started from nothing, just like him. It was in these late-night sessions at the lawn house that he began to see the world differently. He realized that success wasn't just about money or status. It was about knowledge, determination, and the ability to adapt to whatever life threw your way. If he could learn, if he could build his knowledge, then he could create his own opportunities, just like the people he read about. One evening, as he was reading an article on entrepreneurship, he came across a quote that struck him like lightning. "The only limit to our realization of tomorrow is our doubts of today." It was a tribute to Franklin D. Roosevelt, a name he recognized but hadn't studied much. The words seemed to leap off the screen, speaking directly to him. His doubts, his fears, they were the only things holding him back. If he could let go of those doubts, if he could believe in himself the way his mother had believed in him, there was no telling what he could achieve. From that moment on, something shifted inside him. He started to approach his studies with a new intensity, no longer just reading to pass the time, but absorbing every bit of information with a purpose. He began to think strategically, making notes in a worn-out notebook he carried everywhere. He jotted down ideas for businesses, lists of books he wanted to read, and quotes that inspired him. His dreams were no longer vague wishes. They were becoming plans, tangible steps toward a future he was determined to build. As the weeks passed, the boy's routine became more focused. He went to school during the day, worked at the bakery in the afternoons, and spent his evenings at the lawn house, studying until his eyes burned. His classmates didn't understand his drive. Most of them were content with the idea of staying in the town, getting jobs at the local factories or stores. But he couldn't settle for that. He wanted more, not just for himself, but for the memory of his mother, for the people who had believed in him, like Joao and the nuns at the orphanage. Then, one afternoon, something extraordinary happened. It was a warm day, and the boy had decided to take his book on economics to the small park near the church, a quiet spot where he often went to read. As he sat on the bench, flipping through the pages, he felt a presence nearby. Looking up, his heart nearly stopped. Standing a few feet away was the man from the bakery, the one with the luxury car, the one who had unknowingly sparked his journey of self-discovery. The man was looking directly at him, a curious expression on his face. "I remember you," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. "You were at the bakery a few years ago, weren't you?" The boy nodded, too stunned to speak. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the boy. "What are you reading?" he asked, glancing at the book in the boy's hands. The boy quickly showed him the cover, an old, worn book on economics that he had borrowed from the school library. The man smiled, a hint of approval in his expression. "You're trying to learn, aren't you? Trying to get out of here." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, as if the man could see right through him. The boy nodded again, still unable to find his voice. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said. "I didn't come from much either, but I worked hard, learned everything I could, and made something of myself." He paused for a moment, as if considering something. Then, to the boy's astonishment, he said, "I'm opening a new office in the area. I could use someone like you, someone with drive, with ambition. Would you be interested in working for me?" The man's offer hung in the air like a lifeline. For a moment, the boy could hardly believe what he had heard. Was this real? Could it be that the man, the same one who had inspired his journey all those years ago at the bakery, was now offering him a job? The boy had dreamed of opportunities like this, but he had never expected one to come knocking so suddenly, so unexpectedly. He had prepared himself for a long, slow climb, one where every step forward would be a struggle. But now, it felt as though fate was offering him a shortcut, a chance to jump ahead. If only he had the courage to take it. He stood there for a moment, frozen, before realizing that the man was waiting for an answer. "Yes," the boy said, his voice steady despite the excitement bubbling inside him. "I'd be interested." The man smiled, nodding as if he had expected nothing less. "Good," he said. "Come by my office next week. We'll get you started." With that, the man handed him a small card with an address printed on it. The boy took it, staring at the card as though it held the key to his future, which, in many ways, it did. The man left shortly after, his luxury car gliding smoothly down the road, leaving the boy standing in the park, still holding the card. For a few moments he remained there, as if rooted to the spot. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he ran back to the orphanage, his heart racing with excitement and nerves. As he crossed the familiar streets, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This was his chance. The opportunity he had been working toward, the break he had been hoping for. He had spent so many nights at the lawn house, reading articles and watching videos about people who had turned their lives around, about entrepreneurs who had built empires from nothing. Now, for the first time, he felt like he was on that path too. When he arrived at the orphanage, he was too restless to stay inside. Instead, he made his way to the small courtyard behind the building, where a few children were playing under the watchful eye of one of the caregivers. Sitting on a bench, he pulled the card from his pocket again and studied it. The address was in a part of town he wasn't familiar with, an area that seemed far removed from the world he had known growing up. He wondered what kind of office it would be, what kind of work he would be doing. The man hadn't given him many details, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was that he had been noticed, that someone had seen potential in him. Over the next few days, the boy prepared himself mentally for what was to come. He knew this was just the beginning. The man had offered him a job, but it would be up to him to prove that he was worthy of it. He would have to work harder than ever to show that he was capable of more than just sweeping floors and serving bread at the bakery. This was his chance to show the world and himself that he could be more than the boy from the orphanage, more than the son of a woman who had died too young. He would prove that he could rise above the circumstances of his past. The night before his first day at the office, he couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with thoughts of what the future might hold, of how his life was about to change. He lay awake in the small room he shared with two other boys, staring at the ceiling and thinking about his mother. He imagined what she would say if she were here, how proud she would be to see him taking this step. "I'm doing this for you, May," he whispered into the darkness. "I'm going to make you proud." The next morning, he woke early, too anxious to wait any longer. He dressed in the best clothes he had, an old shirt and a pair of slacks that were a little too big for him, but would have to do. The caregivers had tried their best to provide for him and the other children, but the orphanage had always struggled to make ends meet. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he felt a surge of determination. His clothes might be humble, but that wouldn't stop him from making the most of this opportunity. When he arrived at the address on the card, his heart skipped a beat. The building was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the worn streets of his neighborhood. It was the kind of place he had only seen in movies or read about in books. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling out of place in his ill-fitting clothes. But then he reminded himself why he was there. This was his chance, and he wasn't going to let fear hold him back. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The lobby was vast and elegant, with marble floors and tall windows that let in streams of sunlight. He approached the front desk, where a receptionist greeted him with a polite smile. "I'm here to see Mr. Lopez," he said, hoping he didn't sound as nervous as he felt. The receptionist nodded and directed him to the elevator, where he pressed a button for the 5th floor, his heart pounding in his chest. When the doors opened, the boy found himself in a hallway lined with glass offices. It was all so different from anything he had ever known, and for a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake, if he was really cut out for this world. But before he could dwell on his doubts, a familiar voice called out to him. "There you are," said Mr. Lopez, stepping out of one of the offices. He looked as confident and composed as ever, his suit perfectly tailored, his expression calm but focused. "Come in. We have a lot to discuss." The boy followed him into the office, trying to steady his nerves. Inside, the room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city. Mr. Lopez gestured for him to sit, and for the first time, the boy realized just how serious this opportunity was. This wasn't just a job. It was a chance to learn from someone who had already achieved the kind of success he had only dreamed of. "I've been watching you," Mr. Lopez said, sitting across from him. "I see a lot of potential in you, but potential isn't enough. You need to be willing to work harder than you ever have before, to push yourself beyond what you think you're capable of." The boy nodded, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. He had expected hard work. He was no stranger to that. But hearing Mr. Lopez speak with such conviction made him realize just how much was at stake. This wasn't going to be easy. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." Mr. Lopez smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a kind of knowing look, as if he understood exactly what the boy was thinking. "Good," he said, "because this isn't going to be a typical job. I don't just want someone to file papers or make coffee. I want someone who can learn, who can grow, who can eventually become more than just an employee. I want someone who can help me build something bigger." The boy's heart raced. This was more than he had ever imagined. "I can do that," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I'll learn. I'll grow. I want to be a part of this." For the rest of the meeting, Mr. Lopez laid out his vision for the new office, explaining how he wanted to expand his business in the region and how the boy could play a role in that. The details were overwhelming, but the boy listened intently, soaking up every word. By the time the meeting ended, he felt both excited and terrified. This was his chance, but it was also a challenge unlike anything he had ever faced. He knew he would have to work harder than he ever had before, to prove himself in a world that was foreign and intimidating. As he left the office that day, the boy felt a mixture of emotions: hope, fear, excitement, and determination. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path, a path that could lead him to a future he had only dreamed of. The first few weeks at Mr. Lopez's office were unlike anything the boy had ever experienced. It was a whirlwind of new faces, unfamiliar tasks, and a pace that often left him feeling overwhelmed. He quickly realized that the world he had stepped into was far more demanding than he had anticipated. There was no room for mistakes, no time to second-guess himself. Each day was a test, a challenge to prove that he was capable of more than just surviving. He had to show that he could thrive in this environment, that he was willing to do whatever it took to earn his place. From the moment he walked into the office each morning, the pressure was palpable. The sleek, modern space buzzed with activity. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, conversations murmuring in the background. The boy had been given a desk near the back of the main floor, tucked away in a corner, where he could observe without being in the center of the action. At first, he was tasked with menial jobs, answering phones, organizing files, and running errands for the more experienced employees. It wasn't glamorous, but he understood that this was part of the process. Everyone had to start somewhere. He would stay late most nights, long after his co-workers had gone home, trying to absorb as much as he could. He studied the documents he filed, taking notes on contracts, business strategies, and financial reports. Even though no one had asked him to, he wanted to learn everything. He remembered what Mr. Lopez had said about growth, about becoming more than just an employee, and he was determined to live up to that. The boy saw this as more than just a job. It was his education, his real-world school where the stakes were high and the lessons would shape his future. But as the weeks went by, the weight of it all began to press down on him. The sheer volume of information he was expected to learn, combined with the fast-paced environment, left him exhausted. There were days when he doubted himself, when the task ahead felt too monumental. He was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by people who seemed to know everything, who moved through the office with the confidence he lacked. He started to wonder if he was truly cut out for this life. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, he found himself alone in the office. The others had left, the lights dimmed, and the soft hum of the city filtered through the large windows. He sat at his desk, staring at the piles of paperwork in front of him, feeling the weight of his own expectations. It had been a long time since he had visited his mother's grave, but in that moment, he felt the familiar pull of her memory. "May," he whispered under his breath. "I don't know if I can do this." His thoughts drifted back to the promise he had made her, the vow to become someone she would be proud of. It was that promise that had fueled him for so long. But now, for the first time, he felt doubt creeping in. What if he wasn't strong enough? What if he failed? The thought terrified him. Not just a fear of failure itself, but the fear of letting down the people who believed in him, the people who had invested in him. Mr. Lopez had given him this opportunity, and the boy was desperate not to waste it. Just as he was about to pack up for the night, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Mr. Lopez standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Still here?" Mr. Lopez asked, though it wasn't really a question. The boy nodded, unsure of what to say. There was a long pause before Mr. Lopez spoke again. "You know, I wasn't much older than you when I started out," he said, stepping into the room and leaning against the edge of the boy's desk. "I didn't have anyone to guide me. I had to figure it all out on my own." The boy listened intently, surprised by the unexpected personal admission. Mr. Lopez rarely spoke about his past, and the boy had always assumed that he had come from wealth or privilege. But now, hearing that his boss had once been in a similar position, he felt a sense of connection. "I had to work harder than everyone else," Mr. Lopez continued. "I made mistakes, more than I care to admit, but I learned from them. That's the key. It's not about never failing. It's about how you handle failure when it comes." The boy nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I just don't want to let anyone down." Mr. Lopez regarded him for a moment, then smiled. A real smile this time, not the calculated one he often used in meetings. "You're not going to let anyone down," he said. "You've already proven that you belong here. Now it's about staying the course. Don't worry about impressing anyone. Just focus on learning, growing. The rest will follow." The boy absorbed those words, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten just a bit. He realized that he had been putting too much pressure on himself, expecting to be perfect right away. But this was a process, and it was okay to struggle along the way. What mattered was that he kept moving forward, kept pushing himself to grow. After that conversation, something shifted inside him. He approached each day with a renewed sense of purpose. no longer fearing failure, but embracing it as part of the journey. He started asking more questions, taking more initiative, and gradually his confidence grew. The boy who had once felt out of place in the office now found himself becoming more comfortable, more at ease with the challenges that came his way. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. As the months passed, the boy's responsibilities began to grow. Mr. Lopez noticed his dedication and began to assign him more complex tasks. He was no longer just filing papers or answering phones. He was sitting in on meetings, taking notes on important deals, and even contributing ideas when asked. It was a slow progression, but each small victory gave him the confidence to keep going. Outside of work, his life was still centered around the orphanage. Even though he was now earning a salary, he continued to live there, helping out the caregivers and spending time with the younger children. The orphanage had been his home for so long, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility toward it. He didn't want to forget where he had come from, even as he worked to build a new future for himself. The nuns who had raised him were proud of his progress, though they often worried that he was working too hard, that he was putting too much pressure on himself. But the boy reassured them that he was fine, that he was doing what he needed to do to succeed. On Sundays, after attending church, he would walk through the cemetery to visit his mother's grave. It had become a routine, a quiet moment of reflection where he could reconnect with the promise he had made her. "I'm getting there, May," he would say softly, standing before the simple wooden cross that marked her final resting place. "It's not easy, but I'm trying." Those visits gave him strength, a reminder of why he was pushing himself so hard. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for her, for the life she had wanted to have but had never been able to give him. At work, Mr. Lopez continued to mentor him, pushing him to think bigger, to see the world in broader terms. He encouraged the boy to take risks, to step outside his comfort zone. "Success isn't about playing it safe," Mr. Lopez would say during their conversations. "It's about taking calculated risks, about seeing opportunities where others see obstacles." The boy took those words to heart, applying them not only to his work, but to his life as a whole. He started setting bigger goals for himself, thinking not just about the immediate future, but about where he wanted to be 5, 10, 20 years down the line. It was a daunting thought, but also an exciting one. For the first time, he could see a path forward, a path that led to a future far different from the one he had once imagined. And so, the boy pressed on, determined to prove to himself and to the world that he could rise above his circumstances, that he could become the man he had promised his mother he would be. As the months rolled by, the boy, now growing into a young man, began to settle into his new life. The intense challenges that had once overwhelmed him started to become more manageable, and he found himself adjusting to the pace and expectations of the office. Mr. Lopez had been true to his word. The boy was no longer simply an employee doing small tasks in the background. He was learning, growing, and taking on responsibilities that pushed him to think critically and strategically. Every day brought new lessons, and with each passing week, the young man felt his confidence solidifying. But with this newfound confidence came a shift in his perspective. He was no longer just content with surviving or getting by. Now, he wanted to thrive. The lessons he absorbed at the office were giving him a clearer understanding of the business world, how decisions were made, how deals were negotiated, and how success wasn't just about knowledge, but about timing, intuition, and the ability to take risks. These weren't things he had learned in school or through the books he had read in the lawn house. They were lessons from the real world, and they were shaping him into someone he barely recognized anymore. On the surface, not much had changed. He still lived at the orphanage, still helped the caregivers with the daily chores, and still visited his mother's grave every Sunday after church. The other children looked up to him, not just because he was older, but because they could see that something was different about him. He carried himself with more purpose, more direction. He wasn't just a boy who worked at the bakery anymore. He was becoming someone with a future. At work, the young man began to take on more complex tasks. Mr. Lopez had been impressed with his dedication and attention to detail, So he started involving him in meetings with clients and partners. These meetings were unlike anything the young man had ever been exposed to. Sitting in a conference room with men and women who wore tailored suits and spoke with confidence about multi-million-dollar deals was intimidating at first. But over time, he began to observe patterns. How certain people dominated the conversation, how others quietly assessed the room before speaking, and how Mr. Lopez always seemed to know exactly when to step in and take control of the discussion. The young man took mental notes during every meeting, learning from each interaction. He began to understand that success wasn't just about being smart or working hard. It was also about understanding people. It was about reading the room, knowing when to speak and when to listen, and being able to navigate the complex web of relationships that made up the business world. These were lessons that couldn't be learned from books. They had to be experienced firsthand. One of the first real opportunities to prove himself came when Mr. Lopez entrusted him with a small project. It wasn't a major deal, but it was significant enough to give the young man a chance to show what he had learned. The task was to prepare a report on a potential business partnership with a local company that had been struggling financially. Mr. Lopez wanted to assess whether it was worth investing in or if it would be too risky. The young man threw himself into the project with everything he had. He stayed late at the office, poring over financial reports, researching the company's history, and trying to get a sense of its potential for growth. He consulted with other members of the team, asked questions, and took careful notes. For days, he barely slept, his mind racing with numbers and strategies. He wanted this report to be perfect, not just because it was his first real responsibility, but because he knew that this was his chance to prove to Mr. Lopez and to himself that he belonged here. When the day finally came to present his findings, the young man was nervous but prepared. He had practiced his presentation over and over again, making sure that he could explain his conclusions clearly and confidently. As he stood in the conference room, with Mr. Lopez and several senior executives watching, he took a deep breath and began. The presentation went smoothly. The young man outlined the company's financial struggles, highlighting both the risks and the potential opportunities for growth. He had discovered a few key pieces of information that others had missed. Details about the company's upcoming product launch and a potential partnership with another firm that could turn things around. By the time he finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then Mr. Lopez nodded approvingly. "Well done," Mr. Lopez said, a slight smile on his face. "You've given us a lot to think about." The relief that washed over the young man was overwhelming. He had done it. He had taken on a challenge and succeeded. It wasn't a huge victory in the grand scheme of things, but for him, it was a turning point. It was the first time he truly felt like he had something to contribute, like he wasn't just learning anymore. He was doing. He had proven, not just to Mr. Lopez, but to himself, that he could handle the pressure, that he could step up when it mattered. After the meeting, Mr. Lopez pulled him aside. "You did well today," he said, his tone serious. "But don't let this go to your head. This is just the beginning. There will be more challenges, harder ones, and you'll need to be ready for them." The young man nodded, grateful for the praise but fully aware that Mr. Lopez was right. This was only the first step. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more obstacles to overcome. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had taken his first real step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. Over the next few months, the young man continued to take on more responsibilities. He became more involved in the day-to-day operations of the office, learning how to manage not just projects but people. He developed relationships with his co-workers, earning their respect through his hard work and dedication. Slowly, he started to feel like he belonged. Outside of work, his routine remained largely the same, though his perspective was changing. The orphanage, which had once been his whole world, now felt smaller, more distant. He still cared deeply for the people there, especially the children who looked up to him. But he was beginning to see a future beyond those walls. He was saving money, investing in his education, and planning for the day when he would leave the orphanage and strike out on his own. Despite his growing responsibilities and the increasing demands on his time, the young man never forgot the promise he had made to his mother. Every Sunday, without fail, he would visit her grave, kneeling before the simple wooden cross and speaking to her in the quiet of the cemetery. "I'm getting closer, May," he would say softly. "I'm working hard. I'm learning. I'm becoming the man you always believed I could be." These visits were a source of strength for him. They reminded him why he was doing all of this, why he was pushing himself so hard, why he was striving for success. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about honoring the memory of his mother, about fulfilling the promise he had made to her so many years ago. And it was about proving to himself that he could rise above the circumstances of his past, that he could create a future that was entirely his own. As the young man's responsibilities at work continued to grow, so did his ambition. He began to think bigger, to dream of what his life could be in the years to come. He no longer saw himself as just an employee, working for someone else's success. He wanted more. He wanted to build something of his own, to create a legacy that would last long after he was gone. And with each small victory, each step forward, he felt himself getting closer to that dream. But he knew that there were still challenges ahead, that the path to success was far from guaranteed. There would be failures, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But now, more than ever, he believed that he could overcome them. He had learned that success wasn't about never failing. It was about persevering in the face of failure, about getting back up every time life knocked you down. And so, with determination in his heart and the memory of his mother guiding him, the young man pressed on, ready for whatever came next. Years passed, and the boy who had once swept the floors of the bakery and worked late nights in a lawn house had transformed into a man with a clear purpose. He was no longer the timid teenager unsure of his future. Now, in his mid-20s, he had grown into a confident, sharp, and respected professional, the right-hand man to Mr. Lopez, one of the most successful business figures in the region. His rise had been steady but challenging, with every step earned through relentless effort, late nights, and an unwavering commitment to growth. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Each stage of his journey had tested him in new and unexpected ways. He had faced failures, made mistakes, and endured moments when everything seemed to hang by a thread. But through it all, he had kept going, driven by the memory of his mother and the promise he had made her all those years ago. Every setback was an opportunity to learn, to grow stronger. And with each challenge he overcame, his determination solidified into something more, something that felt like unshakable strength. Mr. Lopez had noticed a change. Over the years, he had gradually increased the young man's responsibilities, trusting him with more complex tasks, bigger decisions, and eventually, entire projects. At first, the young man had been cautious, afraid of making the wrong move or letting Mr. Lopez down. But as his confidence grew, so did his ambition. He wasn't just content with following orders. He began to take initiative, to propose new ideas, and to lead projects in ways that pushed the company forward. One day, as they sat in Mr. Lopez's office overlooking the city skyline, the older man leaned back in his chair and regarded the young man with a thoughtful expression. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and curiosity. "When I first met you, I wasn't sure if you had what it took to make it in this world. But now I see that you're not just surviving, you're thriving." The young man nodded, but he remained humble. "I've learned a lot from you," he said, meeting Mr. Lopez's gaze. "But I know I still have a long way to go." Mr. Lopez chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're always too modest. That's a good quality, but don't sell yourself short. You've become someone I rely on, someone I trust. That's not something I say lightly." The words meant more to the young man than he could express. Coming from someone like Mr. Lopez, a man who rarely handed out compliments, it was a sign that he had truly earned his place. But the praise didn't make him complacent. If anything, it fueled his desire to keep pushing, to keep striving for more. He had come a long way, but he knew that there was still so much he could achieve. Around the office, his reputation had grown as well. His co-workers no longer saw him as the quiet, unsure boy who had started out answering phones and filing paperwork. Now, they respected him as a leader, someone who got things done. He had earned their trust through his work ethic and his ability to handle pressure. In meetings, they listened when he spoke, knowing that his insights were backed by experience and careful thought. And when challenges arose, they turned to him for guidance. But even as his professional life flourished, the young man never forgot where he came from. He still lived modestly, saving the majority of his earnings rather than indulging in the luxuries that his colleagues often enjoyed. He wasn't interested in expensive cars or lavish homes, not yet at least. His focus remained on building something lasting, something that would not only secure his future, but also honor the people who had helped him along the way. The orphanage, in particular, remained close to his heart. Though he no longer lived there, he visited often, bringing supplies, donating money, and spending time with the children who still called the place home. The caregivers, many of whom had raised him, were proud of the man he had become. "You're an inspiration to these kids," one of the nuns told him during one of his visits. "They see what you've achieved, and it gives them hope." That sense of responsibility weighed heavily on him, but in a good way. He wanted to be a role model for the children, to show them that no matter how difficult their circumstances might be, there was always a way forward. He wanted them to know that with hard work, perseverance, and a little bit of luck, they could build the lives they dreamed of. But for all the progress he had made, the young man knew that he was still climbing. There were still goals he had yet to reach, dreams he had yet to fulfill, and the higher he climbed, the more challenging the path became. The stakes were higher now. He wasn't just responsible for his own success. He was responsible for the success of the people who worked under him, the projects he managed, and the future of the company he had helped build. It was during this period of growth that Mr. Lopez made an announcement that would change everything. "I'm expanding the company," he told the young man one day after a particularly intense meeting. "We're opening a new branch, and I want you to lead it." The young man was stunned. He had known that Mr. Lopez had big plans for the future, but he hadn't expected this. Leading a branch would be a massive responsibility, a test of everything he had learned over the years. But more than that, it was a sign of Mr. Lopez's faith in him. The older man wasn't just giving him a promotion. He was giving him the chance to prove that he could stand on his own, that he could lead. "I won't let you down," the young man said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'll make sure the new branch is a success." "I know you will," Mr. Lopez replied, his tone firm but kind. "That's why I'm trusting you with this. You've earned it." The months that followed were some of the hardest of the young man's life. Leading the new branch came with challenges he hadn't anticipated. The workload was immense, the pressure constant. There were days when he questioned whether he had taken on too much, whether he was truly ready for the responsibility. But every time doubt crept in, he pushed it aside, reminding himself of how far he had come. He had faced difficulties before, and he had overcome them. This was no different. Slowly, the new branch began to take shape under his leadership. He hired a team, established new business relationships, and set ambitious goals for growth. The work was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time, he was truly in charge, making decisions that would shape the future of the company. And as the branch grew, so did his confidence. He was no longer just an employee. He was a leader, someone who was trusted to make things happen. Yet even as he poured himself into his work, the young man never lost sight of his roots. He continued to visit the orphanage, to spend time with the children and support the caregivers. And every Sunday, he still made his way to the cemetery, kneeling before his mother's grave and updating her on his progress. "I'm getting closer, May," he would say quietly. "I'm leading now. I'm making a difference." His visits to her grave were more important than ever. They grounded him, reminded him of why he was working so hard. It wasn't just about building a successful career. It was about fulfilling the promise he had made to her. It was about proving to himself and to her that he could rise above the circumstances of his past and become the man she had always believed he could be. As the new branch continued to thrive, the young man's reputation grew even further. He became known not just as Mr. Lopez's right-hand man, but as a leader in his own right. Clients and colleagues respected him, not just for his business acumen, but for his integrity and dedication. He had built something real, something that was making an impact. But through it all, he remained humble, always remembering the boy he had once been, the boy who had worked in a bakery and studied by the dim light of a lawn house computer. That boy was still inside him, driving him forward, reminding him that the journey was far from over. 20 years had passed since that first fateful meeting with Mr. Lopez, and the boy who once felt out of place in a world of polished suits and high-stakes business had grown into a man with a story of his own. The climb had been steep, filled with struggles, victories, and moments of doubt, but he had made it. Now, as the director of the company and the right-hand man to Mr. Lopez, he had become everything he had once dreamed of. He had built a life that far exceeded the boundaries of the small town where he grew up, and in doing so, he had fulfilled the promise he made to his mother so many years ago. But despite his success, there was one thing he had never forgotten: where he came from. He hadn't forgotten the long hours spent working at the bakery, or the quiet moments of reflection at his mother's grave. He hadn't forgotten the orphanage that had given him a home when he had none, or the caregivers who had supported him through the darkest times. No matter how far he had risen, his roots were deep, and they called him back in a way that no achievement could replace. It had been years since he had visited the old neighborhood, but now, with his life settled and his career thriving, he felt the pull to return. He wanted to see the place where his journey had started, to stand in the spaces that had once seemed so small but were now monumental in his memory. He wanted to pay tribute to the people who had shaped him, the places that had given him strength, and most of all, to honor the memory of his mother, the guiding light that had carried him through every challenge he had faced. On a warm spring afternoon, he drove back to the neighborhood, accompanied by his wife and children. His car, a sleek, polished vehicle that mirrored the one Mr. Lopez had driven into the bakery all those years ago, rolled smoothly over the uneven streets, a stark contrast to the modest homes that lined the road. He hadn't expected the flood of emotions that hit him as they approached the familiar landmarks of his childhood. It was as though the past was rushing back to meet him, and with every passing moment, he felt more connected to the boy he had once been. His wife, seated beside him, noticed a change in his expression. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, sensing the weight of the moment. He nodded, though his throat felt tight with emotion. "I'm just remembering," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." They pulled up in front of the old bakery, the place where everything had begun. The building looked smaller now, more worn than he remembered, but the smell of freshly baked bread still wafted through the air, just as it had all those years ago. The familiarity of it filled him with a deep sense of nostalgia. As he stepped out of the car, he couldn't help but smile at the memories that rushed forward: his first job, the kind words of Senor Joao, the customers who had treated him with kindness even when life felt so uncertain. He entered the bakery with his wife and children, feeling a sense of homecoming. The interior had changed a little over the years. The counters were the same, the shelves lined with bread and pastries that he had once arranged as a boy. The woman behind the counter looked up as they walked in, her face lighting up with recognition. "It's you, isn't it?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. "You're the boy who used to work here. Joao always talked about you." He smiled, humbled that his time at the bakery had left an impression even after so many years. "Yes, it's me," he replied, glancing around the shop. "This place was my first step. I learned a lot here." They bought some bread, more out of sentiment than necessity, and lingered for a few moments longer before stepping back outside. The streets were as familiar as ever, though the years had left their mark. The houses were a little more worn, the paint peeling from the sides, the windows fogged with age. But despite the changes, it was still the place where he had grown up, and it would always hold a piece of his heart. From the bakery, they made their way to the old church, the one attached to the orphanage where he had lived for so many years. The building stood as a silent testament to his childhood, its weathered walls and simple architecture reflecting the humility of the community it served. As they approached, he saw some of the nuns he remembered from his youth. They were older now, their faces lined with the passage of time, but they still carried the same warmth and kindness that had comforted him as a child. One of the nuns, Sister Maria, recognized him immediately. "Look at you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've become everything we hoped you'd be." The words touched him deeply, and for a moment, he struggled to find the right response. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for all of you," he finally said, his voice soft. "You gave me a home when I had none." They spent some time walking through the orphanage, now home to a new generation of children. He shared stories with his wife and children, pointing out the rooms where he had slept, the courtyard where he had played. It felt surreal, as though he were walking through a memory. The place seemed both smaller and larger than it had in his youth. Smaller in size, but larger in significance. Every corner, every room held a piece of his past, and it felt good to reconnect with it. After visiting the orphanage, they made their way to the cemetery. It was the last stop on their journey, the place where he had always found solace, even in the most difficult times. As they approached his mother's grave, he felt a familiar tug of emotion, the bittersweet mix of sadness and gratitude that always accompanied these visits. He had come so far since the last time he had stood here, but in many ways, it felt like no time had passed at all. Kneeling before the simple wooden cross that marked her grave, he reached out and gently touched the weathered wood. "May," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm back, and I did it. I become the man you always believed I could be." His wife stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, while their children watched quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. For a long time, he stayed there in silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had faced countless challenges, had stumbled many times along the way, but in the end, he had succeeded. He had built a life that his mother would have been proud of, a life that honored her memory and fulfilled the promise he had made so many years ago. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, he stood and gazed out at the horizon. "It wasn't easy," he said quietly, speaking to his mother in his heart. "I failed many times, but I kept going, and now I'm here." He glanced at his wife and children, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "Thank you, May," he whispered. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." And with that, he turned and walked away, his heart full, knowing that he had finally come full circle. He had returned to the place where it all began, but this time, he was leaving as a man who had achieved what once seemed impossible. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.